The day my mother told the lawyer I deserved nothing from my father's estate. She didn't hesitate. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't even look at me. She pushed the stack of inheritance papers across the table toward my brother as if I weren't even in the room. She thought the decision had already been made. She thought I would sit there quietly like I always had. What she didn't know was that my father had written one final condition into his will, one she had clearly overlooked. My name is Liana. I'm 30 years old. My father passed away 3 months ago after a long battle with heart failure. For the last 18 months of his life, I was the one sleeping in hospital chairs, signing medical forms, arguing with insurance companies, and feeding him soup when he was too weak to lift a spoon. My brother, Daniel, visited when it was convenient. My mother told everyone he was busy building his career. I was told I had more flexible time. That was how it always worked in our family. Daniel was praised. I was practical. Daniel was potential. I was obligation. The inheritance meeting was held in a quiet law office downtown. The room smelled faintly of paper and coffee. A long wooden table separated us from the lawyer, Mr. Henley, who had known my father for years. My mother arrived dressed in black, composed and confident, as if this were simply the final step in a plan she had already settled in her mind. Daniel sat beside her, hands folded neatly, wearing an expression that tried to look humble but couldn't quite hide anticipation. I sat across from them. No one asked how I was holding up. No one mentioned the months I spent driving back and forth to the hospital. Mr. Henley began reviewing the will, his tone steady and formal. My father's assets weren't enormous, but they were significant. The house, savings accounts, investments, a small piece of land he inherited from his own parents. As the numbers were read aloud, I noticed my mother's posture straighten. Then she cleared her throat. "I'd like to clarify something before we continue," she said. Mr. Henley paused. "My husband always intended for Daniel to handle the estate," she continued smoothly. "He's the responsible one. Liana has made her own life. She doesn't need anything." The words landed like a slap. I looked at her, waiting for her to soften it. She didn't. "She wasn't around much," my mother added. "She chose to live independently. Daniel stayed close to the family." I felt my pulse quicken. Stayed close. I wanted to laugh at the distortion. I was there when my father couldn't breathe without assistance. I was there when he whispered that he didn't want to die in the hospital. I was there when he asked me to promise I wouldn't let anyone fight over money after he was gone. But I didn't interrupt. Not yet. Daniel shifted slightly, pretending discomfort. "Mom," he said lightly, though he didn't correct her. "Let's just see what Dad wrote." But he didn't push the papers back. He didn't defend me either. My mother reached forward and physically nudged the folder toward him. "You deserve this," she said quietly, but loud enough for me to hear. Deserve. I felt something tighten inside my chest. Not jealousy. Not greed. Erasure. She wasn't just redistributing money. She was rewriting history. I folded my hands on the table to keep them steady. Mr. Henley adjusted his glasses. "Well," he said carefully, "we should finish reading the document before drawing conclusions." My mother smiled confidently. She thought this was procedural. She thought the outcome was already sealed. She had no idea that near the end of the will, my father had written something neither of them had mentioned. And when that clause was read aloud, the entire room would shift. My mother didn't wait for the lawyer to continue. Once she began, it was as if she had been rehearsing this speech in her head for weeks. "Daniel sacrificed a lot," she said smoothly. "He stayed nearby. He checked in constantly. He helped your father with decisions when things became complicated." I stared at her. "Checked in constantly?" There were hospital weeks when Daniel didn't even answer his phone. "I'm sure Liana meant well," she added, her voice soft but sharp underneath. "But she has always chosen independence over family responsibility." Independence. The word was framed like an accusation. I felt heat rising in my chest, but I kept my posture straight. If I reacted emotionally, it would only reinforce the picture she was painting. Daniel shifted in his seat again. "Mom, we don't need to go into all that," he said lightly. But he didn't correct her. He didn't say that I was the one who learned how to operate Dad's oxygen machine. He didn't say that I was the one who left work early when the hospital called. He didn't say that I was the one holding Dad's hand the night he couldn't sleep because he was afraid he wouldn't wake up. He let her talk, and that silence said enough. She wasn't there for the difficult conversations. My mother continued, "When your father needed financial planning, Daniel handled it." I almost broke then, because I remembered those financial planning conversations. I was in the room when Dad asked about long-term care costs. I was the one who pulled out my laptop and compared coverage options while Daniel said, "Just do whatever makes sense." But to her, involvement wasn't measured in presence. It was measured in image. Mr. Henley cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Alvarez, the will is quite specific," he said. "Your husband documented his wishes clearly." "Yes," she replied confidently. "And he trusted Daniel?" There it was again. Trusted. I looked at the folder on the table. The thick, cream-colored pages looked almost harmless. But inside those pages was 18 months of truth, or 18 months erased. My mother turned slightly toward me for the first time since we sat down. "You've built your own life," she said, as if offering comfort. "You don't need this house. Daniel plans to start a family. He needs stability." I noticed the pattern. Daniel needed, I chose. Daniel sacrificed, I distanced. Daniel was responsible, I was independent. Every word carefully arranged. "Liana has always been strong," she continued, her voice steady. "She doesn't rely on us." Strong. Another compliment that wasn't one. Strong meant disposable. Strong meant capable of losing something without complaint. Strong meant she could take it. I inhaled slowly. "For the record," I said calmly, my voice steady despite the pressure building in my chest. "I was at the hospital almost every day." The room stilled. My mother didn't even blink. "You visited," she corrected. "Visited, as if I were a guest in my father's final months." "I signed his medical forms," I said quietly. "That's because you were available," she replied. "Available, not devoted, not committed. Available." Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes lowered. He still hadn't defended me. He still hadn't told the truth. Mr. Henley finally spoke again. I believe," he said carefully, "that we should proceed to the final sections before assigning roles." Final sections. My mother gave a small, satisfied nod. She truly believed this was a formality. She believed my father would have rewarded proximity over presence. She believed the story she had been telling for years, that Daniel was the future, and I was just supportive. What she didn't know was that my father had been very clear in writing, and he had documented more than affection. He had documented actions, and once those words were read aloud, the version of me she had just described would collapse completely. The air in the room shifted as Mr. Henley adjusted the final pages of the will. My mother leaned back slightly, confident, almost relieved, as if this were the closing scene of a story she had already decided the ending to. Daniel sat straighter now, hands folded on top of the folder she had pushed toward him. He didn't open it yet. He didn't need to. In his mind, it already belonged to him. I sat still, not because I agreed, but because I knew something they didn't. My father was many things. Quiet, stubborn, proud, but he was not careless. When his condition worsened, he had asked to meet with Mr. Henley privately. He didn't tell my mother everything they discussed. He didn't tell Daniel either. But he had told me one thing. People show who they are when things are hard. He whispered one night in the hospital, his voice thin from medication. And I pay attention. At the time, I didn't know what he meant. Now, sitting in that office, I was beginning to understand. Mr. Henley cleared his throat again. "We have reviewed the primary asset distribution," he said evenly. However, there is an addendum attached to the will. My mother frowned slightly. An addendum? She asked. Yes, he replied. Added 6 months before your husband's passing. Daniel glanced at her, confusion flickering across his face. I wasn't aware of any addendum, my mother said carefully. That is not unusual. Mr. Henley answered. Your husband requested privacy for that section. Privacy? The word landed differently than anything else that morning. My father had anticipated something. Mr. Henley turned the page slowly, deliberately. This clause states, he began, reading directly from the document. In the event of dispute regarding distribution, the entirety of my estate shall transfer to the individual who has been the primary caregiver during the final 18 months of my life. The room went completely still. My mother's lips parted slightly. Daniel's posture stiffened. Mr. Henley continued. Primary caregivers shall be defined by documented hospital records, medical authorization forms, insurance filings, and appointment logs. Every word felt heavy, measured, specific, not emotional, factual. I didn't move. I didn't look at my mother. I kept my eyes on the lawyer. There is also an additional condition, he added calmly. Any attempt to misrepresent involvement or influence distribution through false claims shall result in immediate forfeiture of inheritance rights. The silence after that sentence felt suffocating. My mother blinked twice, as if trying to process what she had just heard. That can't be right, she said finally. Mr. Henley didn't argue. He simply turned the document toward her. It is signed and notarized, he replied. Daniel's face drained of color. What exactly qualifies as primary caregiver? He asked, his voice tighter now. Mr. Henley opened another file. We have certified copies of hospital visitor logs, he said. Miss Alvarez signed as emergency contact on 12 separate admissions. She authorized 3 medical procedures. Insurance correspondence lists her as primary point of contact. Primary, the word echoed in the room. I felt my pulse in my fingertips. My mother's eyes slowly turned toward me. For the first time that morning, she wasn't confident. She was uncertain. I handled financial decisions, Daniel said quickly. I was involved. In what capacity? The lawyer asked. Daniel hesitated. There were no signatures with his name, no late-night hospital entries, no records of him sitting in waiting rooms until dawn. Just good intentions and occasional visits. Intentions weren't documented. Presence was. My mother leaned forward suddenly. This was never meant to divide the family, she said sharply. My husband would not have wanted conflict. He anticipated it. Mr. Henley replied quietly. That is precisely why the clause exists. And in that moment, the story she had told about me, independent, distant, uninvolved, began to unravel. Because the truth was written in ink. And ink does not bend to narrative. The silence in the room was no longer tense. It was exposed. My mother's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her knuckles turning pale. Daniel leaned forward, staring at the page in front of him as if reading it again might somehow change the wording. It doesn't say entirety, my mother muttered under her breath. Mr. Henley gently tapped the paragraph. It does, he said evenly. The entirety of the estate, the house, the savings, the land, everything, not divided, not negotiated, transferred to the primary caregiver, he repeated. My heartbeat felt loud in my ears, but outwardly I stayed still. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I simply watched the weight of those words settle across the table. Daniel was the first to react. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice tight. Dad wouldn't cut me out. He didn't cut you out? Mr. Henley replied calmly. He established a condition. A condition based on paperwork? Daniel pressed. That doesn't measure emotional support. Legal documents rarely measure emotion, the lawyer said. They measure evidence. Evidence. My mother looked at me slowly, as if seeing me from a distance for the first time. You manipulated this, she said quietly. The accusation didn't shock me. It was easier than accepting reality. I didn't even know about the clause. I replied evenly. That's convenient, Daniel snapped. Mr. Henley raised a hand gently. There is no indication Miss Alvarez was aware of this addition. He said, in fact, your father requested it be sealed until today. Sealed? My father had known this meeting would happen. He had known my mother would assume. He had known Daniel would sit comfortably in that chair expecting everything. And he had prepared. Why would he do that? My mother whispered. The question wasn't directed at anyone. It was directed at her own certainty. I thought about the nights in the hospital when Dad would squeeze my hand and say, "You don't have to prove anything. I see you." He saw. That was enough. Mr. Henley opened another folder. In addition to hospital logs, he continued, we have billing records showing medical co-payments made from Miss Alvarez's account. Daniel's head snapped toward me. You paid? He asked. Yes, I answered quietly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic. It was necessary. And you never mentioned that, he added. I didn't think I needed applause. The words came out softer than I intended. But they landed anyway. My mother exhaled slowly, her posture sinking. He trusted you with everything, she murmured. Not to me, but to herself. No, I corrected gently. He trusted whoever stayed. That distinction mattered. Staying, not promising, not planning, not assuming, staying. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly. So that's it? He said. I get nothing? Mr. Henley's voice remained steady. The clause also states that any attempt to misrepresent involvement results in forfeiture. The room tightened again. You claimed earlier that Daniel was the primary decision-maker. The lawyer added carefully, if that statement is formally contested, documentation will be reviewed under oath. Under oath. The implication was clear. My mother's earlier speech, about Daniel sacrificing, about me being absent, suddenly carried weight she hadn't intended. This is absurd, she said weakly. We're family. Yes, Mr. Henley replied quietly, and your husband anticipated disagreement within that family. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, because this wasn't about money. It was about being erased in a room where I had done the hardest work quietly. And now, the ink on that page was undoing years of narrative. My mother looked at me again, not angry, not confident, just uncertain. And for the first time in my life, she didn't know how to control the outcome. The room no longer felt like a legal office. It felt like a courtroom, not because anyone was shouting, but because the truth had shifted from opinion to documentation. And documentation does not argue. It presents. Daniel's jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscle moving beneath his skin. This doesn't mean she gets everything automatically, he said, trying to steady his voice. We need verification. You will have it, Mr. Henley replied calmly. He opened a thick file and began placing documents on the table one by one. Hospital visitor logs, signature records, insurance authorization forms, my name, over and over, in ink, in timestamps, in dates that matched nights I remembered vividly. March 14th, the lawyer read, emergency admission. Miss Alvarez signed consent. I remembered that night. Dad couldn't breathe. Daniel didn't answer his phone. June 2nd, procedure authorization signed by Miss Alvarez. I remembered that too. Mom had said she couldn't handle hospitals. September 19th, insurance dispute resolved by primary contact, Miss Alvarez. I remembered crying in the parking lot afterward, exhausted. Daniel stared at the pages as if they were accusations. You never told us you were doing all this, he said. I didn't think it was something to announce. I replied. You made it look like I didn't care. He shot back. No, I said quietly. You made it look like you were busy. That landed. My mother leaned forward, her voice shaking slightly now. She chose to live across town, she insisted. She wasn't even home. I moved closer to the hospital, I answered. The truth sounded almost boring when spoken plainly, I drove there every morning before work. I continued. I left early. I used vacation days. I used unpaid leave. The lawyer nodded. Payroll statements confirm multiple absences corresponding with medical events. He said, payroll statements? Even my sacrifices had receipts. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. You think paperwork means you loved him more? He demanded. No, I said softly. It means I showed up. That was the difference. Love is emotional. Care is measurable. And my father had chosen measurable. My mother looked at the stack of documents like they were something foreign. I was there too, she whispered. Yes, I agreed gently. But you weren't the one signing. The room fell quiet again, because she knew that was true. When Dad needed decisions made, she froze. When forms needed signatures, she passed them to me. When bills arrived, she handed them over. And I handled it, not for inheritance, not for leverage, because someone had to. Mr. Henley folded his hands neatly. Based on the clause and supporting documentation, he said evenly, the estate transfers in full to Miss Alvarez. The finality of that sentence settled like weight in the room. Daniel's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he leaned back. This is insane, he muttered. It's legal, the lawyer corrected. My mother's eyes filled. Not with pride, not with relief, but with something I couldn't immediately name, regret. Not for the money, for misjudging the balance of power. She had walked into this meeting believing narrative would override evidence. She had believed that calling me independent, distant, self-sufficient would diminish what I had done. But paper doesn't bend to perception. And now, every line she tried to erase had reappeared in black and white. No one moved for several seconds after the lawyer spoke. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slamming of hands against the table. It was worse than that. It was quiet. My mother stared at the documents as if she could will them to rearrange themselves. Daniel looked stunned, but beneath that shock was something sharper. Resentment. This can't be the final decision, my mother said finally, her voice tight. There must be some room for adjustment. A discussion. Mr. Henley shook his head gently. Your husband's will is legally binding. The clause is clear. The documentation supports it. She turned toward me then, her composure cracking. You're really going to take everything? She asked. There it was. Not. Are you okay? Not. Did we misunderstand you? Not. I didn't know you were carrying so much. Just. You're going to take everything? I felt something inside me steady. I didn't ask for this, I said calmly. He wrote it. You could share, Daniel said quickly, as if grasping for control. We can divide it fairly. Fairly? The word almost sounded hollow. Was it fair when you let her say I wasn't there? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. My mother's voice rose slightly. You're punishing us. I'm not punishing anyone, I replied. I showed up. That's all. She shook her head, tears forming now. You always made yourself look stronger than you were, she said. You never told us how much you were doing. I didn't need to advertise it. You could have said something, Daniel muttered. I did, I said softly. You just didn't hear it. The truth hung between us again. Not sharp, not explosive, just undeniable. My mother leaned back in her chair, her shoulders sinking. I thought you were distant, she admitted quietly. I was exhausted, I corrected. That was the difference. Distance is a choice. Exhaustion is a consequence. For years, she interpreted my silence as detachment. She saw my independence as separation. She assumed that because I wasn't loud about my sacrifices, they didn't exist. But my father had noticed. He hadn't needed speeches. He had watched who stayed when staying was inconvenient. And now, that observation was written into law. Daniel ran a hand down his face. So that's it, he said bitterly. You walk away with everything. I looked at him steadily. No, I said. I walk away with what he decided. My mother inhaled shakily. You're tearing this family apart. The words were almost automatic. But this time, I didn't accept them. No, I replied gently. We were already divided. Today just made it visible. That was the moment she lost the last piece of control. Because she could no longer frame me as selfish. She could no longer frame me as absent. She could no longer push papers toward Daniel and expect silence. For the first time in my life, the version of me she believed in didn't match reality, and there was nothing she could do to rewrite it. The meeting didn't end with shouting. It ended with signatures. Mr. Henley slid the final documents toward me, the same way my mother had pushed the folder toward Daniel earlier, confident, certain, convinced of the outcome. Now the papers were in front of me. The house, the accounts, the land, everything my father built over a lifetime. My mother sat very still. Daniel stared at the table. No one looked at me the way they had at the beginning of the meeting. There was no superiority in my chest. No thrill. No satisfaction. Just clarity. I picked up the pen. For a second. I thought about the nights in the hospital when Dad couldn't sleep. When the machines beeped softly in the background. When he squeezed my hand and said, "You don't owe anyone explanations." He knew this day would come. He knew there would be assumptions. He made sure assumptions wouldn't win. I signed. The sound of the pen on paper felt louder than it should have. Mr. Henley gathered the documents carefully. "It is finalized," he said. "Finalized." Daniel stood abruptly. "So what now?" he asked, not looking at me. "That depends on you," I replied calmly. My mother finally lifted her head. "I never meant to make you feel invisible," she said quietly. I held her gaze. "You didn't make me feel invisible," I answered. "You treated me like I was." The distinction mattered. Feelings can be dismissed. Actions cannot. She swallowed. "I thought Daniel needed more support," she admitted. "And I didn't?" I asked gently. Silence. That silence said more than anything else she could have said. For years, I had been labeled strong. Strong enough to handle it. Strong enough to sacrifice. Strong enough to receive less. Strong enough to deserve nothing. But strength is not the same as absence of need. I stood up slowly. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I don't want applause. I just don't want to be rewritten." Daniel finally looked at me then. "You could share it," he said again. But the confidence was gone. I considered that for a moment. Not because I felt pressured, because I was deciding. "I'll decide what to do with it," I said. But not because I'm obligated. Because I choose to. That was the difference between us. Choice. I gathered my bag. My mother watched me carefully, as if seeing a version of me she had overlooked for years. "You're walking away with everything," she said softly. I paused at the door. "No," I replied. "I'm walking away with what I earned." I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back dramatically. I simply stepped out of the office and into the hallway. The weight of the estate no heavier than the weight I had carried quietly for 18 months. The person who was told she deserved nothing walked out with everything, not because she fought, not because she demanded, but because she stayed. And this time, staying had been written in ink.